Using the code example from the previous lesson where we created our getNameFromID, we discussed the idea of a function closure, and then we kind of worked out that we had in fact created what we call a higher order function. So a higher order function, often written as HOF for example, has typically two characteristics. The first, it could return a new function. So for example, inside we are here, in fact, returning a new function from an initial function. So we've got two nested layers, one layer of function being called after one has returned. So that's typically what our getNameFromID function is doing for us. That is by definition a higher order function because it returns us a brand new function. After we pass in the ID, we then return this function, and then when we call it down below, for example, the second function then gets invoked. It has access to the ID, which is in our closure scope, and then it can go and find that particular item and return us the name. So this is all nice and well. We're not going to do much coding in this video. We're just going to talk higher order functions and definitions. Can you spot the other higher order function? And I'm not talking about these lines here. We've actually used another higher order function inside of here, and that is the array prototype find. Now I mentioned that there are in fact two different characteristics of a higher order function. The first is it returns a new function, and the second is a function that can take another function as an argument. And what we mean by that is our array prototype find. So what we're in fact using is a function inside of here, and we could actually split this out into a variable. However, it would have to be inside of this particular function scope because we need access to the ID. So we couldn't, for example, move the function out here because our ID property doesn't exist. So that's the second characteristic of a higher order function, is that it can take other functions as arguments. And that is exactly what we are doing to array prototype find. We are passing that in there. So in fact, find is another higher order function, and we're using a higher order function to create some logic inside of another higher order function, which simply returns us a function. Now, the reason that this is often called a callback, or it's often referred to as a callback function, is because it is called back by the higher order function. So the array prototype find is in charge of invoking this. We just simply supply it. Now, the reason we are diving into this is because we need to realize the two different approaches of a higher order function. We need to know that we can return a new function, such as this, and we also need to know that we can pass functions as values. And if you've ever heard the term functions in JavaScript are first-class citizens, and what that really means is it's a value, which means we can assign it to a variable, or we could pass it as a value. So for example here, we are passing that item as a value. However, we are also assigning this to a variable of const getNameFromID. A few benefits that we get from higher order functions in functional programming is that it allows us to write more simple and readable code, and is a nice abstraction that we can use through something called composition when we want to compose more complex software, or at least our program. So all of this explanation on our higher order functions is going to help us on our journey to understanding functional programming in a lot more detail. There's also an interesting concept called currying, which we're going to look at in the next video. And we've kind of almost done it already because we're treating our different functions as separate arguments. So here we're calling one function and here we're calling another. And this is kind of the idea in currying when we deal with functional programming. So in the next video, we're going to deal with currying in a lot more detail. We're going to write our own curry functions and then discuss a concept called partial application. So that's it for this video. We've now understood a higher order function, and I'll see you in the next one.